Since the morning I had strange feelings inside, my body was trembling with anxiety and I really couldn't understand what was happening to me. It was pouring a heavy downpour and I had already made breakfast and was setting the table as my husband stormed out of the house and I barely had time to kiss him. Business really is like that, that's what he always liked to say. It was so gloomy outside, it played havoc with my head as soon as I took the pills and sat down on the couch. It had only been about 15 minutes, maybe 20. All of a sudden the doorbell rang. It was strange though I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door with a big surprise. It was Tom, all wet and very worried. I could see sparks flickering in his eyes, which even such a heavy rain couldn't extinguish. Tom, my husband's best childhood friend, they had been friends for about 35 years. I was always amazed at how they could trust each other so much in everything. They had even chosen the same college to be close to each other. Tom asked permission to come in. I couldn't help but let him in. Yes, we knew each other. This was a friend of my husband's and despite my doubts, I couldn't leave him in the pouring rain. He stood on the doorstep, soaking wet, with a smile that seemed oddly confident despite his drenched appearance. He said his car had broken down nearby and he just needed a cup of hot tea to warm himself up. I nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house immediately became tense. The feeling grew, as if the atmosphere itself sensed our confusion. I'd never been alone with my husband's friends, and that made the whole thing even more awkward. While I made tea, he talked about how he'd been caught in the rain and complained about the cold that had gotten to his bones. But even through the lightness of his words, I sensed something was wrong. His attempts at joking seemed strained and his laughter seemed nervous. It made me feel even more constrained. The dim light in the room and the pounding of the rain against the windows created an atmosphere of isolation, as if we were cut off from the world. Every sound, the raindrops of rain, the clatter of a spoon on a cup, our awkward phrases seemed much louder than they really were. Suddenly there was silence. I felt anxiety begin to rise inside me, as if I were on the verge of something incomprehensible, something I feared but couldn't quite fathom. He fell silent, sitting across from me, and then, breaking the silence, he asked a question that caught me off guard. What if it hadn't been Michael then, but me first? Would you have done things differently? My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't know what to say. His words sounded so sudden that it took my breath away. My eyebrow raised in surprise, and my forehead wrinkled in bewilderment. I felt my insides tighten with embarrassment. How could he ask such a question? And what did he mean by it? My head was frantically searching for answers, searching for words, but all I could manage was to mumble, "Me? What do you mean?" I started to stutter, trying to make sense of his question, but nothing was coming together. I could feel the tension in the room building, and suddenly he stood up and walked to the window. He stared out at the rain, as if trying to find answers in this endless stream of water running down the glass. His back was tense, his shoulders slightly slumped. The minutes dragged on like hours. I couldn't understand what was happening. It all seemed wrong, ridiculous. And then, after a few long moments, he said quietly but confidently, "I've always admired you, Mary. In fact, more than you know." The words hit me like a thunderclap. I sat there in a daze, unable to believe my ears. Admired him. My thoughts were in a state of confusion. I didn't understand what it meant or why he was saying it now. Why? What was he trying to prove? While I was trying to make sense of what I was hearing, he turned abruptly. His gaze was filled with determination, and something in his facial expression made me tense up. This wasn't just a friend of my husband's, this was a man who was looking at me with some strange fire in his eyes. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time, hiding his feelings, but now he couldn't stay silent any longer. "You know, I've always wanted to be in Michael's shoes," he continued, taking a step toward me. But I've always been there, watching, waiting. My heart was pounding frantically in my chest. What was I supposed to say? How was I supposed to react? This whole situation felt unbelievable, almost surreal. I knew that every word he said had a destructive force on my quiet world. He pulled up a chair and sat closer, his gaze growing harsher and more piercing. Maybe you don't feel the same feelings, but I've been feeling more than friendship for you lately. Although you might just be hiding your feelings because you have a husband. I know. His voice was quiet, but in that silence I could hear too much subtext, too much hidden emotion that I hadn't noticed until that moment. Tom, he, with his friendly smile and his always jokes, was now standing in front of me as if he were a different person. I saw his hand move slowly toward me, seeking to touch mine. My heart clenched. My first reaction was panic. How do I get out of this situation? What do I say? How do I avoid this strange intimacy that came so unexpectedly? It didn't feel right. Everything seemed wrong, contrary to everything I thought was the norm. He kept talking, confessing to me the feelings that he said had been muting him for a long time. I stared at him, trying to realize the depth of what was happening. Every time Tom came to our house, every encounter, every look, it all turned out to be not what it seemed. All his smiles, all his friendly words, now I saw them in a different light. Tom was talking, and I was sinking deeper and deeper into my thoughts, trying to realize how I'd missed it before. I didn't know what I would say to Michael. How could I explain it? The thought of keeping this moment from my husband immediately sent a wave of guilt and fear through me. If I kept silent, I would be lying to him. But if I told him, I would ruin our friendship, ruin our home, ruin everything. What's worse, keeping the secret or telling the truth? The questions swirled in my head, one thought succeeding another like a lightning strike on this stormy night. The rain outside the window was getting heavier, and the sound of it mingled with Tom's voice, which seemed to be pulling me deeper and deeper into the vortex. I tried not to listen to his words, trying to cling to the only saving thought: I have a husband, I love him. I repeated it to myself over and over, as if it were a mantra that could shield me from what was happening. But by the minute, his presence was getting heavier and heavier, and even my words about loving Michael seemed like a weak defense. Maybe I wasn't saying it for Tom so much as for myself. To remind myself of what was important, what was right. Tom, please. I tried to speak, but my voice sounded too quiet, as if I couldn't believe my own words. I have a husband. I love him. My hands were shaking, and I hid them under the table so he wouldn't notice. Tom didn't take his eyes off me, and in his gaze I saw a mixture of desperation and determination. He was standing too close, the closeness scaring me. He was Michael's friend. His best friend. How could this have happened? How was this possible? I know you have a husband, and I know it's hard, he continued, his voice almost a whisper. But I can't pretend anymore, Mary. Every time I see you together, I feel like I'm losing my chance for happiness. I always thought that if things had gone differently back then when you met Michael, we could have been together. Those words cut right through me. I suddenly realized that this wasn't just a fling. It was deeper than I had realized. But even in that admission, I felt resentment. Not at Tom, but at the situation. At the cruel game I'd suddenly been dragged into without even asking for my consent. I tried to stand up. I needed to distance myself from him, to create physical distance. He wasn't supposed to be this close to me. But my legs were shaking, and I realized I couldn't move from my spot. Tom, this isn't right. You know it's wrong, I mumbled, clutching my hands under the table so tightly that they started to hurt. Michael is my husband, your friend. But you yourself don't feel this tension between us. He interrupted, his eyes glittering as if he were on the verge of a breakthrough. Have you never thought of me? Just once. I couldn't breathe. That question caught me off guard. Sure, I'd thought about Tom, but always as a friend, as someone I could trust. I'd never seen him any other way than as a friend of our house. But now that image was crumbling before my eyes, and I didn't know how to rebuild it. Tom was trying to build bridges between us, but I felt those bridges crumbling with every word he said. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The words weren't coming. I wanted to just disappear from this moment, to go somewhere where everything would be clear and simple again. You have to leave, I finally said quietly. He got up very quickly, pushed his chair with a frenzy and walked to the door, looked back. His gaze became so familiar and sad in an instant. He didn't say anything, just walked out and disappeared into the rain. When Tom left, I sat in silence, listening to the rain continue to pound on the windows, and I felt like the sound was reaching deep inside, shattering everything I was trying to keep whole in my soul. I couldn't realize what kind of world I was in. Everything happened so suddenly, as if it wasn't a real moment, but some strange dream from which I still couldn't wake up. But it wasn't a dream. Tom had really confessed his feelings to me. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't just get it out of my head. His words echoed in my mind over and over again. Maybe you're hiding your feelings. No, that's ridiculous. I'm not hiding. I've just been lying to myself for a long time. Hiding the truth from myself. Justifying every move, every attempt to ignore the obvious. It's not what it looks like, I thought, even though I knew it was. I realized it wasn't about Tom and his feelings. The problem wasn't him, or even what he'd said to me. The real problem was my marriage. Michael and I tried to convince myself that this was only temporary, that his immersion in work was just a phase that would soon pass. But the truth was, I was living with a ghost. The ghost of the man I once knew, the man I was once happy with. We loved each other. I remember those nights when we laughed, when we lost track of time, when we just sat together, not noticing the seasons changing outside the windows. We were a couple in love, so absorbed in each other that the world around us seemed secondary. And I missed it. I missed the Michael who could forget everything when we were together. I missed the way we looked at each other, knowing it was forever. But forever turned out to be more fragile than I thought. And the cracks that had begun to form in our marriage grew deeper with each passing year. Michael was no longer the kind of man who could just hold my hand to feel warmth. Instead, his hand was always occupied with his phone, his laptop, anything but me. And every time, during our intimate moments, he would suddenly say that he had a call coming up, that he needed to make it quick, because things weren't waiting, something inside me would break. Slowly, piece by piece. I realized that our intimacy was gone. We had lost each other, but I was still holding on to the ghost of what had been. Maybe I was afraid to admit it. Because to admit it would be to start something new. And new is always the unknown. We're used to our ways, to our lives. We're used to the lack of intimacy. Used to these cracks, as if they were part of us. But now that Tom had made his confession, it all suddenly came out. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't lie to myself that there was nothing wrong with our marriage. And that didn't mean I had feelings for Tom. This wasn't about him. It was about Michael. It was about us. I could no longer ignore the obvious. Our marriage was crumbling, and I was standing in the wreckage, trying to keep something whole. Too much of my focus was on keeping up appearances, on pretending nothing was happening. But deep down, I knew everything was falling apart. And it made me feel hollow inside, like something important was slipping through my fingers and I couldn't stop it. When I heard the noise of the car, everything inside me turned upside down. I went to the window and saw Michael, my husband, who hadn't been close to me in a long time. My thoughts raced through my head like a hurricane. Should I tell him what had happened? Or maybe I was confused about my own feelings. Maybe I was feeling something for his friend. I didn't know what was happening to me. Michael walked into the house the way he usually did, like I was just part of the interior. He gave me a quick kiss on the forehead and, without lingering, went on his way. That scene was a symbol to me of how things have worked out between us for years now. I am his wife, his life partner, but lately I have become invisible to him. This can't go on forever. I am a woman, and I need emotions, I need real feelings, attention, which I haven't gotten for a long time. How long can I put up with his indifference? Enough. I suddenly felt determined. Something inside me had changed, and I told myself it was time to end this apathy. His words stuck in my ears and head like sharp knives. I didn't know what to say. Everything was so confusing. But something about his reaction surprised me. I finally saw some emotion from him. He finally showed that he cared. And strangely enough, I felt joy. I thought our relationship was beyond saving. But in that moment, despite his anger, I felt that he loved me after all. We talked for a long time. It was one of those rare occasions when we really connected like we used to. We sat over a cup of tea, discussing our lives, our problems, our feelings. And for the first time in a long time, I heard the most important thing from him. I've resolved all the work issues, Michael said, his voice calmer, as if it were no longer tense. Now I'll be able to spend more time with you. I couldn't believe my ears. Those were the words I'd been waiting for. I felt like maybe we still had a chance. A chance to regain the closeness we'd lost.